Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Milton Keynes Litfest and to our third series of Open University sponsored events in which we're exploring borders and literature. On 4 Monday evenings this March, we're hosting online conversations with contemporary writers about different aspects of the relationship between these two concepts. You'll find links to podcasts of the previous episodes of our collaboration on the Litfest website, or we'll post links in the chat here later on. Our online OU collaboration leads into an event as part of our next in-person festival taking place in April. On Friday the 24th, the journalist and broadcaster John Elledge will be in conversation with the OU's Daria Chernysheva, talking about the issues raised in his book, A History of the World in 47 Borders. You can attend in person in Waterstones, Milton Keynes, or we'll also be live streaming the event to you wherever you may be. If you've not already done so, you can sign up for the festival email newsletter at our website, www.mklitfest.org, and you'll be the first to know news of our future work. At which point, let me hand over to Donald McAvoy from the Open University's Language, Literature and Politics Research Group to introduce tonight's event.
Thanks for that warm introduction, Dave. The Open University's Language, Literature and Politics Research Group is delighted to be partnering with MK Litfest to put on this series, Borders in Literature. Each of our online events will be chaired by my OU colleagues and members of the research group, and recordings will be available later on the MK Litfest's online channels. You can find out more about the Language, Literature and Politics Research Group and about the OU's creative writing provision on the university's website. So please do post your questions in the chat as soon as they come to you. We'll be collecting them as we go along, ready to share them with our speaker toward the end of tonight's event. If the chat function isn't accessible to you, you can always raise your hand later when we turn to the audience for questions, and we'll try to ensure we get to as many of you as possible. So in tonight's event, my OU colleague Philip Seargeant will be talking to Tim Marshall, whose best-selling book, Prisoners of Geography, argues that physical geography, the landscape in which we live, helps determine where political borders lie, how secure they are, and how communities and states act in relation to one another. The book was republished last year in a revised and updated version to take account of the crucial role that disputes over borders have played in global politics over the last decade. Sadly, we should probably live in anticipation of further revisions. Philip and Tim, over to you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Donal, and thanks for joining us, Tim. As Donal suggested, the overarching theme for this little series we're doing is borders. So I thought I could start with the lines that you quote from the Bilad al-Arab al-Watani, which is, as you say, described as the unofficial national anthem of the Arab world. And the line you quote is, "No borders can separate us, no religion can divide us," to which you add, "In reality, there is little sense of unity at the political level, and factionalism is rife." And in many ways, when I was reading through this again, it struck me that this is in many ways a sort of the utopian inverse of the way things actually are, both in that region, but also elsewhere. There are obviously very consequential political borders. In the Arab world, many of them very artificially constructed. There are deep religious divisions, and across the Middle East, as elsewhere, there are geographical features which act as natural borders between groups. And I suppose it's this combination, and especially the overlooked nature of the last of these, which is the topic of your book. So the first question I wanted to ask, when people talk about geopolitics, they often focus on ideology, on leaders, getting an awful lot of that at the moment, or short-term events. So why do you think it is that people overlook or have overlooked traditionally or conventionally this role that physical geography plays in shaping political outcomes?
I think some people think it's difficult, even though it's not. The basic concepts are quite easy to grasp. I was very pleased that Donal said that this helps us to understand because, I'm not a determinist. I don't think it's the most important thing. It's just one of many important things. But but people don't seem to factor it in. And I think there is a reluctance, including in academia, to accept that it's almost like nature. We can't overcome parts of nature. And then there's another thing, which is that the concept of geopolitics got a dirty name after World War II because parts of it had been bastardized by Nazi Germany. The concept of Lebensraum, for example, living space. And so people were quite reluctant to think that the natural landscape partially shapes what we do. I also like that you started with that quote from the Pan-Arabic national anthem, because you can absolutely understand why you would want a Pan-Arabic nation with its one language, and I wouldn't say it's a homogeneous culture, but and also the suffering of the very disparate peoples in a region which had been colonized. You can see why they would want to come together. But it was an absolute pipe dream from the beginning, was when the Syrians, Egyptians tried to come together, and it would be now if anybody tried it. And that's because people are too different and they want different things.
Yeah. And do you think, in terms of, I mean, I said in the question that it was sort of a perception, or there was a lack of awareness of, or
Mm,
it's too complicated um, um, to get one's head around in the public imagination. Do you think policymakers also
mm.
underestimate these constraints? I mean,
Yes.
they're obviously, we've had, looking
Well,
back at history.
there's some very good ones who know their stuff, and then there's some ones who don't, and some who aren't interested. I think the military understands better because they're dealing with terrain whenever they go about their business. I'm not sure the politicians really are because they come and go at the top level. One minute you're the housing minister, and the next minute you're supposed to be running foreign policy, and yet you know very, very little about it. So of course the SPADs, the special advisors, that's the role they should play, but they often come from the Ministry of Education into the Foreign Office. So then you defaulting to the full professional civil servants, and yes, they know their stuff, but they advise, they don't decide. So I don't think there is a real well of knowledge in most governments, but there are some extremely, extremely clever people within there. I mean, a good example, I think, Downing Street. Who wrote Citizen Clem? Uh, Downing Street had a foreign policy advisor for about five successive prime ministers. Just knew his stuff inside out.
Hmm.
But I think they're quite rare, actually. I just don't think that they think strategically and have that historical knowledge which has taken place on the geography that we're talking about. And those two things seriously inform you about why the stuff that's happening now is happening now. And of course they can't. They've got to be looking at energy policy and how to win that by-election.
Hmm. Yeah, and presumably it's been ever thus, and even with our sort of the sort of knowledge we've accrued over the years. I mean, some of the
Mm,
biggest, classic defeats have been people being underestimating geography rather than the enemy. So yeah, I was going to say, as Donal mentioned, and as you say in the in the introduction to the new book, that you've covered everything that was you've well no, you've included an awful lot of new material, but if you'd covered everything that was relevant since the first edition, you'd need the proverbial forklift to lift the manuscript up. So one of the questions was, do you think geography is always present in the background of conflict? Um,
yes.
even when, okay, so with regards to that one.
In what? Yeah, I mean, obviously to a greater or lesser
Yeah.
degree, but in some way, yes, always.
In terms of the way it plays out,
In
ultimately.
terms of the cause of the conflict, and yes, the way it plays out, yes, yes. I mean, I'd be happy to be given an example where it was totally irrelevant. but I can't think of one.
You can't think of one. Yeah, that was the question. Can you think of one? So no is the is the answer. I wanted to go back to the first edition of the book and ask you about the timeliness of it. So obviously, the institution I work for, the Open University, was started as as a product of a period when I think the notion, as in the name itself, the notion of borders of there was a relaxing of attitudes to that in the popular imagination, certainly, even of push towards breaking down some sort of borders, widely understood. Um, when you first wrote the book, I presume 12 years ago or so, 13 years ago, when you were writing it, the situation was very different. We just had the global financial crisis, I guess. And then we were on the verge of Brexit and Trump. Um, and then I think in the last 10 years, the notion of borders has become even more inherent, even more central to our politics. So I wondered, looking back now, how how much of the time in which you were writing it went into the book, if you see what I
Mm,
mean?
mm.
And also, looking back now, how much do you think the argument reflects? Yeah, well, how much does the argument reflect of that particular geographical moment? Or is there some nuance around the
I
way?
think the argument reflects all recorded history.
Yeah.
I don't think things are that different, but there is a nuance within that. And yeah,
Mm,
you have hit on something if you're talking about when it came out, because I argue that my generation is, one of the luckiest ones that's ever lived, but it's an aberration. The post Second World War consensus, such as it was, the coming together of the EU, they tried to put to bed 2,000 years of history. Let's see.
mm,
Um, but I think that's an aberration in history. And this idea of open borders, I mean, a little bit of pushback there. I think that only ever came about in academia and with
yeah.
students. I don't think ordinary people ever bought into that whatsoever. Um, so when it came out, we were and we still are, in a state of flux. Those great institutions, those norms of the post-Second World Order, right through the Cold War, were ending. And I think we're seeing it even more clearly now. And that's confusing. When eras end and new ones begin, it's a confusing time. And so I think it hit a nerve in coming out when it did, because it seeks, and the idea that geography plays a central role, helps to give clarity and a framework to understand why stuff happens. So yeah, I think I hit lucky in the timing then, but I also think that the rather unfortunately and sadly hard geopolitical worldview that I have, and sometimes I wish I didn't, I think is the norm. Not it's not unusual.
Mm. And in terms of the reception of the book, as you say, it sort of it was almost prescient as it came out just before in 2015, just before these things really became sort of part of the a part of the very mainstream public conversation. But do you think there was anything that went in terms of the writing of it? You say you've had this geopolitical
Yeah.
worldview all your life, and presumably because of the experiences you've had. But it does strike me that it was written at a very interesting time, as I say, after. Well, I mean, you talk in the book about 2001 and or at least I've heard you talk before about 9/11 being a decisive moment. But I presume that the sort of less spectacular but equally dramatic in some ways was the financial crisis, which we're still
Mm.
seeing. So yeah, I was just wondering if there was anything you thought in terms of why that book then for you as the as the author, if you see what I mean, or is not something you've.
Well, yeah, it was shaped from 30 years of reporting, and sadly, arriving at the conclusion that force is what pushes ultimately pushes things, and power does come from the barrel of a gun, as the Marxists say. But I just thought that as we're moving through this time, here is an opportunity to write a book which tries to frame it within a geographical historical perspective. A couple of vignette, one little vignette. I'd been on a plane with former Foreign Secretary David Miliband, who's top fella, super bright. But I remember him saying to me on this plane, we were going to Washington or coming back, whatever it was, and we were talking about Kosovo because I'd covered the Kosovo War, and him telling me that the Russians didn't care about Kosovo, they didn't care about losing Kosovo, and I was busy picking my jaw up off the floor because clearly that's what some people in the Foreign Office have been telling him, and we didn't really have time because it was only a 5-hour flight to explain the Russian viewpoint about humiliation and losing spheres of influence and how they felt about the world. But I was just like, wow, if you think the Russians don't care about Kosovo. And this was the same sort of, I think, thinking that went into ahead of Ukraine, not understanding the geography. Well, here's an opportunity because here's some slides I made earlier. If we put up the North European plane, slide 3, which I put together with some sticky back plastic earlier. And there's more to what's gone on in Ukraine than the North European plain. But the shaded area we're going to see, I hope, in slide 3, is flatland going from France all the way to the Urals. Point being, it narrows in Poland and then it opens up again in front of Moscow and St. Petersburg. And it is through that gap for the past 500 years that the European armies have charged back and forth, sometimes invading Russia, sometimes Russia invading other people. So the point I'm making is if you know that history and you know how the Russians feel about that history being invaded every 50 years or so, you know that they're never ever going to let go of the idea that they should control or even absorb Ukraine. I mean, it's just blindingly obvious when you know the history and the geography. I mean, there's a lot more to the geography than that, obviously. But actually, can we stick up slide 2 as well, please? So when you know that, you know what they're going to do, more or less, obviously not entirely. And then I remember after 2011 and the first invasion, and this is what I wrote in the book, there is no way in hell that the Russians are not going to come back for more. Now, obviously, I don't know when, where, and how, but it's blindingly obvious they are going to come back for more. And I can confidently state now, but sorry, if you're going to look at the slide, if you look at where the Baltic Sea is, and then you look at where the sea in the Carpathian Mountains is, that's that narrow. It's less than 200 miles wide. You're forced to go through that. And as Russia has been invaded through that several times, Napoleon, Hitler, Germans, 1914, you are going to try and block the gap. There's no other thing you're going to do. If we get a chance later, I'll come on to Cuba and explain, its almost existential place in the American political imagination. So the point I'm making, sorry, I'm going off on one now, Phil, is that when you look at the world through that lens, it adds another bit of the picture into this very complicated, large jigsaw that you're trying to focus on. And it allows you, I think, to make better guesses, and that's all they are, about what will happen.
Yeah, I suppose with Ukraine, there's a clue in the name itself. In that,
I'll give you another one, Phil. Sorry, briefly.
Yeah,
People don't explain this enough about what's going on. Why don't they just have a ceasefire? Why don't they give up this part of the Donbass? They've lost nearly all of it. It's because the parts of the Donbass the Ukrainians have not yet lost is where the fortified cities are, on the very, very small bit of high ground that there is in the Donbass. If they're just going to hand those over, I mean, I'm saying I know, nobody knows the future, but within that caveat, I know that within X years, the Russians will advance from those fortified cities, which they have now been given, and enter Kyiv, because there'll be nothing to stop them between there and there. this is the stuff that the news media should be saying, and I hope this is the stuff that our politicians get told.
Hmm. Yeah, I was just going to say there's a clue in the name in that Ukraine, well, at least my understanding is one of the etymologies is that it's borderland. The word comes from
That's
borderland,
right, yeah.
you know. There you go. And I suppose also, yeah, so there's the sort of the notion of history repeating itself, but it's history uh, influenced by geography repeating itself
Mm.
is what you're suggesting. I wonder if well, there were two points I'd sort of be interested to hear to pick up for you to pick up on here. I wonder if one sense is that one sense why there seems to have been this blind spot is that sort of the end of the 90s, going into the 2000s, the prevailing sort of intellectual explanation for how the world was changing was globalization. The
Yes.
notion that distance was shrinking, space and time were shrinking, we had control over them, um, and so forth. And then you also had globalism, this idea that we should exploit that as much as possible. Um, and so, yeah, for the last 20 years either side of the millennium, that was the particular argument, but that seems to have created this idea that, for example, geography is less important than it is now. Would that be
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
reasonable?
And again, I think that's what comes of looking at the last 50 years of history instead of the last 5,000 years of history. I mean, it's like some of the European intellectual class round about 2000. Were arguing that the nation state was withering away and that the corporations would take over, which is
Yeah.
nonsense.
Hmm.
Even now, and I saw who was behind Trump. I saw all the tech bros, but they've all been going cap in hand to him ever since then. And if Musk wants to fire a rocket up, he better ask the state for permission to take off first. So I never bought that argument. Um, Globalization, I mean, I think it's on balance, it may have been a good thing. It is a good thing because it hasn't actually completely retreated. It's
Hmm.
certainly gone into freeze at best. And it did lift a lot of boats. But what people didn't realize is that how many other people it was hurting.
Hmm.
And for example, steel workers in Pittsburgh who currently vote for Trump. And it's completely understandable why they would. I mean, I don't know your politics. It doesn't matter if you absolutely loathe the man, sneer at him, think he's the worst man that's ever walked on God's earth. You can make an argument for all those things. But it won't make any difference because you're not a steel worker in Pittsburgh who saw your industry hollowed out. And I just don't think the intellectual class had a clue that all this stuff was happening. And if you go back to borders again, there was this idea that, oh yeah, the borders will disappear. The first time anybody had a wheat harvest 10,000 years ago, and they managed to grow more than the people on the other side of the mountain where the rain didn't fall. And so they didn't have enough to get them through the winter. Well, if they're going to come over the mountain and say, can we have your wheat? You're going to say no. They are inevitable. Borders are just absolutely inevitable. If you want to have a borderless Britain now, fine. But if we see those lovely people from across that water coming over here and fishing, let's say, right outside Grimsby for 10 miles out, we're going to have a word with them and saying, could you just fish a bit further away because these are the fish that it's just you cannot not have a border. Whether you call it a border, whether you draw maps and put official lines and there will always be. So I just think there was this naivety about it. I'm not arguing against multilateralism and cooperation. Far from it. And I think the EU is an absolutely fantastic idea, but it has its limits. And if you push it too far, you will risk breaking it.
Yeah, yeah. Related to globalization, and indeed one of the sort of notions behind this idea of the shrinking of space and time, and off the back of that, a sort of recalibration of um, the international order and society was the role that technology plays.
Mm,
And there's been, and indeed in the sort of very straightforward definition of globalization or explanation of globalization distance has been collapsed because of technology. I'm wondering how you see that playing into the broader geographical picture, the geopolitical picture you've been
Yeah.
working on, and especially, I mean, if we just take the Iran example, at the moment that's going on as we speak, it's air war, it's a war of the air at the moment, and the sort of traditional geographical boundaries that Iran has and has protected it or been difficult.
This is another example of how, yeah, geography is only one of the elements, but it is always present because you mentioned that it's an air war. Yes. So immediately you can get into the geography of Iran. Why is it only an air war? Well, Iran is bigger than France, Britain, and Germany combined. There's 92 million of them. They've got a minimum of 1 million men under arms. And if you want to get there, you better go over the Zagros Mountains first, and you don't want to do that. How the hell are you going to get your armored stuff over the Zagros through the narrow mountain passes which are still covered in snow? You're not. So all that stuff factors into what the American hierarchy is being told. I mean, if Trump wakes up tomorrow morning and says invade Iran, they might say, well, yes, Mr. President, but if you could just look at this map and see these mountains, what are we going to do? So the point being that geography is playing a role in the decision making. Now,
Mm.
you mentioned shrinking distance, and yes, absolutely. But that just changes geography. I would argue that in every decade or every century, different bits of geography are important. Um, it is no longer really that important where the coal is and will become less important as the decades of this century pass. Where the oil and gas is still absolutely crucial, but will very slowly fade till we get to about 2080, at which point, hopefully, where the renewables are, and this is the other point I was going to make about how geography change, changes through the times, but it's still geography that's important, and that's where the metals are, which is, Dave, slide number 8. So we no longer really care where the coal fields are, but we care very much where the metals are, and we're going after them, all the big powers. And so that then changes your focus of your priorities. So if you look at DRC and Zambia, they're in the middle of Africa. They've got a lot of copper and a lot of cobalt, key metals, and that is why there's so much activity there. The Chinese are there, the Europeans are there, the Americans are there. The Americans have built a huge highway out of DRC and Zambia to Angola's port to get it to go left, and the Chinese have bought massive highways to get it to go right. And this is being played out. Look at that big copper belt going down through South America. Chile can now leverage that. Argentina, with its lithium, can leverage it even more. And this is changing geopolitics because it changes what you do and why you do it. If we have time, Phil, I would like to put the Cuba one up because I think
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
relevant. Thank you. Put slide 9 up. Thanks. And again, this is the lens I view things through. It is not entirely geographic, but whenever I read up on the subject or talk to the real experts, because I'm not one, slide 9 really helps us to understand what happened in Venezuela. So people say, oh, it was all about the oil. That's far too narrow a lens in which to understand what happened in Venezuela. To understand what happened with the kidnapping of Maduro, you have to understand how much China is dominating Latin America, the fact that Hezbollah, ordered by Iran, is all over Venezuela. In fact, Hezbollah is all over Latin America. So let's look at that map. What is guarding the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico, which includes some of the most important American ports? It's Cuba. About 40% of America's exports and imports come through that little gap between Cuba and Mexico and Florida. It's only about what is it, 100 miles? So if a hostile power controls Cuba, as it has every right to do, I'm not making arguments about right and wrong here, just how things are. The Americans will always militate to persuade that government to change the government or to persuade it to be friendly to the United States, because it cannot have a government in Cuba that might allow someone to put missiles on it that can reach America, hence the Cuban Missile Crisis. But there's other reasons as well. They could mine each side of that island and significantly have a problem for American industry. So look where it is in relation to Venezuela. Then look where it gets its oil from, almost entirely. Well, it did from Venezuela. So you go into Venezuela, Delta Force diplomacy, I call it. You kidnap the president, having probably worked out with the authorities that we'll all agree with each other afterwards. Venezuela then stops sending oil to Cuba. Cuban government may or may not collapse this year. You know, they've been trying for the last 50 years. Let's see. But you've significantly weakened a fundamental geopolitical goal. You've enhanced a goal of yours. Equally important, you've said to the Iranians, get out of Venezuela. Equally important, you've said to the Chinese, we're back now. We're concentrating. We're going to be doing the ones trying to do the investing. Venezuela makes bauxite. It has bauxite, I should say. Aluminium is made from it. But a byproduct makes some of the very, very, very thin metals that go into the super semiconductor chips. And the super semiconductor chips are pretty much the battlefield of the 21st century. That's what will drive quantum computing, AI decision making, and all the rest of it. So by going into Venezuela, it's not just about the oil, it's about a big geopolitical picture. This is what I mean, you know, they know what they're doing. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, and I'm not saying it will succeed or fail. I have no idea. But they know why they're doing it, and there is a plan, and Venezuela was a big part of it.
Yeah. I mean, going back to the technology thing, firstly, what strikes me is that it's there's a sort of two-way relationship here. Firstly, we're we're suggesting, or people have in the past suggested that technology, excuse me, is a way of superseding some of the geographical boundaries and shrinking the world and making possible things that in the past weren't. But on the other hand, your argument there is that it's protecting the resources that enhance
Mm.
technology, which paradoxically in this case makes the old geography as important as it always has in some sort of ways, which is an interesting context. If we go back to Iran, as you were saying, it's an air war so far for various reasons, but there seems to be a suspicion, at least, that it can't that in itself that by itself will not be enough to achieve the goals that other than just obliterating the place. I was wondering what sort of technologies do you think have had the most effect on changing how we understand geography? So geography is still very important
Mm.
in those cases, but are there particular technologies within this context that I mean, possibly cyber warfare and things like that, which just allow you to, yeah.
But you know, technology always has, hasn't it? I mean, from day one, you know, if I've got a spear this big, the fella next door unfortunately wants a
Yeah.
bigger one. The English at Agincourt had made from extremely good wood that we have in this country. Their arrows went further than the French arrows. They won. The French then spent the next few years trying to engineer arrows that could go further than the English. You know, I mean, it's the saying now, sadly. ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles, kind of changed equations but you see that's still geography because you're still
Mm.
factoring in distance. How
Mm.
far can this go? Therefore, where should I put defenses? I mean, you never get rid of it. It just changes through the ages. But we are on the cusp now. I mean, you mentioned cyber war, which you've just put it in the whole basket of, tech war,
Mm.
space, satellites. This again is changing what you do, how you do it, why you do it. But we all knew in the 20th century that you had to pay attention to where the oil was. I mean, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, sparking the first Gulf War, if Kuwait didn't have oil, would the Americans really have got the coalition of the willing and charged 70 countries into Iraq? No. And when the Saudis run out of oil, or nobody wants it anymore, are the Americans going to fight for the Saudi solar panels, which they're building? They're not. So it just switches, but they would fight in a scenario I'll just make up, given that Argentina has got the most accessible amount of lithium in South America, and you've probably seen that the president Melier has very good relations with Trump.
Mm.
In the event that, I don't know, Argentina went to war with Brazil, for example, and Argentina was America's main source of lithium, they would fight immediately
Mm.
to help Argentina. So it just changes what is important. But the metals, I pay a lot more
Mm.
attention now to where the metal is because I know that's growing in importance. But you cannot lose sight of where the oil and gas are because that's still what, sadly, we are reliant upon to put the lights on and to have this Zoom meeting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's yeah, the resources. Yeah, one is after the resources. At one strikes me that the Trump approach to Gaza is a perverse extension of this, in that it's one of the reasons it seems he takes an interest is because it's prime real estate.
Yes, he is he reminds me of a used car dealer. But again, people often say that they looked at his tariffs and said, "Oh, he chickened out." I don't buy that. A car dealer says to you, "This car costs £10,000." I mean, no, you don't believe him. He doesn't believe himself. But only an idiot would say, "Yeah, all right, here's 10,000." So you say five, and he says nine, and and then you eventually pay £7,500 or whatever it is.
And you think you got a
But
bargain. Yeah.
but yeah, the point is that if he says, right, you've got 10% tariffs, I'm putting it to 100, and then he climbs down and only accepts 20% tariffs, hasn't he just won an
Yeah.
extra 10%? He's winning.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, first way.
Sorry.
I wanted, before we go and open it up for questions, I wanted briefly to get onto climate change.
Hmm.
It's a slightly fanciful way of putting it, but I mean, if we've been talking about geography constraining, influencing politics, um, climate change is altering geography to an extent.
Yes.
Well, and it's likely to do so more intensively in the time. How how significant is this shift, and what's in terms of the knock-on effects of all this? Because you've been talking about over the last however many tens of thousands of years, the border. But
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, Phil, I don't think I gave enough attention to it.
Mm.
I tried to slip a few more bits in the 10th anniversary edition. I probably undercooked it.
Mm.
Um, uh, because it's affecting geopolitics in a number of ways. Um, Small example, the coffee growers of Central America live in the high ground. That's where the coffee comes from. Climate change is affecting their crops. They're finding it harder and harder to have abundant harvests, cost of living, and all the rest of it. You close your coffee farm, you go down the hill, you go into the valleys where there's not very many jobs. You're not going to stop. You keep going. You head north, which is what was happening, until you get to the Mexican-American border, and then you're trying to get into America. And what does that do to American politics? That helps to get Trump elected. So I do draw a direct line between climate
Mm.
change and Trump being elected. Obviously, there's a lot more to the election than that. Um, the Sahel, I think, would be a basket case anyway, but the desertification, as the sand again after millennia starts to drift down from the Sahara into the Sahel before you get to the middle lush green bit of Africa, that is driving the herders, the nomads, and their flocks down into where the sedentary farmers try to eke a living out, and they're clashing. So there's a similar story in Nigeria, which fuels instability and conflict, which fuels poverty, which fuels people moving, and people move, and that causes instability. And then you look at the effect on our politics in Britain that the movement of peoples has had, and we are several years behind what's happened in Europe. They are several years ahead of us, and we will be going down the same route. And our political parties, I think, are what we now, some of us think of as extreme parties, will grow to become 35, 40% of the electorate, as they have done in France and Sweden and places, Italy and others. Another one, less sort of personal, actually, briefly, because we're probably running out of time, is slide 11, the last one, slide 11, please, Dave. The Northern Sea route. This is more geopolitical and less sort of human, but the Northern Sea route across the top of Russia, if you take that from Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and China, and you go round up through the Bering Strait, take a hard left, go through across the top of Russia, you get your goods to market 7 days before you take the other route. So that's 7 days of fuel costs, 7 days of insurance, 7 days of crew costs, and you get to market quicker. So as climate change has continued, that route is opening up. I mean, it's still a minor route, but it will be a major route. And can you imagine the effect that's going to have across the decades? I'm not talking about next year, but across the decades, 20, 30 years, the effect that will have on Egypt. Because the revenue that Egypt gets from the Suez Canal, imagine if that dropped by 30%, and Egypt has enormous problems because of climate change anyway. These are all the things that are now beginning to play out. Yeah, I undercooked climate change. I confess.
Yeah. And one final question before we open it up, which you've touched on there. I just wondered if you had any thoughts. You've mentioned migration and the necessary movement of people, both from climate change but also from conflict. Um, why do you think society, and that this will lead to even more, the rise of the more extreme parties, even more so? Do you have a sense of why societies struggle to connect those causes of sort of instability abroad,
Oh,
consequences arise? I
you
mean,
mean faraway countries about which we know little?
exactly, yes.
Plus ça change.
It's pretty much just that.
No, I mean, really, that was, we were sold that, weren't we, in the late 1930s, that this is a problem about a faraway country about which we know little. Um, I think we're getting a bit more savvy when it comes to places that have got oil. I mean, the news today is dominated by the cost of
Mm,
living, which, because our petrol prices and plastics and many other things, because plastics are made out of oil essentially,
mm,
they're all going to go up. So I think we're pretty savvy when it comes to things like that. I don't think the argument has quite been made about conflict and population movements. Although again, perhaps Syria taught us that. But no, these are faraway places, and we've got our electricity bills to pay. I'm not casting aspersions on people that don't follow this stuff closely. We've got our own problems. But again, I wish the political class would join the dots up a bit more for us. But sometimes they'd have to make arguments which would be very difficult to sustain. That we have to, for example, if you took this view, we have to go and take action here to, because this will get this conflict. We have to go and bomb people because the conflict will then be over quicker, and then the petrol pump prices will go down quicker. I can't see a politician making that argument, even if it
yeah,
might be true.
yeah. And
No,
it's
it's you're right. We don't really fully tell people. But another problem, sorry, we're getting a bit off subject, and I am trying to leave some time if people want to shout at
yeah,
me. We've got, you got a 28-minute news bulletin, which is where a lot of people get information from. Less so these days, it's Twitter. on that 20, in that 28 minutes are fewer words that would fit on the front page of the Times. And you've got to tell all these stories, including that cat stuck up a tree, because I do want that at the end of the news and finalies. I also want that terrible fire in Glasgow Hospital. I need to know about, so you've got fewer words than would fit on one page of a newspaper. How the hell are you going to talk about the complexities of what we've
Yeah.
spent
Yeah.
48 minutes on?
Yes, absolutely. And thus propaganda fills the gaps. Yes. Thank you very much, Tim. We'll open up to questions. Dave, did you want to point us to any questions? I'm
Yep.
afraid I haven't.
Let me unmute myself. We have quite a number of questions, so
Oh,
let
right.
me
Dear.
scroll back
I don't have
to.
any answers.
um, Let me start with uh, a question from Julie Dawes. Tim, you rightly point to minerals and metals being what current affairs are really about, but also the impact on climate of the cost of consumables, such as coffee and cocoa, is an underlying concern for stock markets.
What was the last bit of the question? Sorry, Dave.
The cost of consumables and their impact as an underlying concern for stock markets and the
Yeah,
knock-on.
well, they look ahead to these things and they try and price them in and, sell, buy accordingly. But yeah, I mean, they price in things sometimes ahead of events. I mean, I watched oil going up before last Saturday's strike. So what are we, day 10 now? But in the sort of 2 or 3 weeks leading up to last Saturday, oil was going up and up and up, went up about 5 to 8% before the first strike. I have found in the city, honestly, I find city people in the big companies, the big insurance companies, they actually follow this stuff and they know more about it than most of the foreign affairs journalists, think tanks, and the others that I speak to. The city people are really on it and they watch it very closely.
A possibly more complicated question for you. Roisin McPhillamy, I do hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Where does Greenland fit into Trump's plans?
Two ways, three ways, three ways. One, strategically, it is the shortest route for Russian submarines. They come under the ice pack, very quite hard to detect them. Shortest route for their missiles is over the top to the North American eastern coast. So if you were to control it, it's not going to invade it. But if you were to, you can put a lot more listening posts, bases, whatever you want over time. That's one. Two, it does have the metals that we've been discussing, lots of them, although it's incredibly hard to get to them. And just how many companies would invest, I'm less sure of. But so what? Just take it. We can sort out the details later. That's the used Carmen salesman thing. But the third thing, and I think this is equally important, you scare the hell out of the Europeans and you get them to take the High North and funding seriously. And that is what he has done right through. And again, people say he's a nutty, and he might be, but Panama was a good example. Everybody said he was going to invade Panama. He wasn't going to invade Panama. He is still smart enough to know that the Americans were burnt by Iraq so badly that they're not going to invade Iran. They might do something there, but not. This isn't Iraq 2.0, thank God. So he just put enough heat on the Panamanian government. Eventually, they thought, you know what? Maybe that contract we've got with the Chinese companies at each end of the ports at each end, they might not hold up in court. And the Chinese sold to an American company. So you don't need to, but he's got the Europeans running scared. Some of them are paying more. Some of them are pretending, like ourselves. Some of us are pretending to pay more on the defence budget to try and placate him. So again, I would say that's a partial victory.
And as he often signs off himself, thank you for your attention in this matter.
We could all learn from that. I found I do it myself.
Indeed. A question from me, if I may, and I guess taking you back to climate change. Another commodity is water, both
Mm,
its rarity in some places, which intensive farming and data center manufacture isn't helping, and its increasing presence in others. I'm thinking particularly about low-lying and coastal cities that
yeah,
are increasingly under threat. How do you see the impact of water playing out in the future?
yeah. I mean, I tinkered with a book about it, but I just don't know quite enough. I remember reading a book, and it was late 70s, called Water Wars.
Mm,
And it seemed prescient at the time, but there hasn't really been one. Iraq and Turkey and Syria have almost come to blows over it, but not. But they might yet, because Turkey is damming the Euphrates. So I do think that its time is now much closer. And that's because of climate change and the shortages of water. And there are several examples, and the two best ones you mentioned salination or the erosion of coastal areas. That's having a huge impact in Egypt, in the
mm,
Alexandria area. The aquifers are being salinated, and they haven't yet got the tech to stop it. And simultaneously, as you know, Ethiopia has built the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and have said to Egypt, "Do not worry, you will have all the Nile waters you have ever had." But a great power cannot think like that. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, fine, I trust you, because they don't trust them.
yeah,
And that is a potential cause for war. Because in the event of a massive drought, and that Ethiopia has held the water back for its own population, and that's its primary concern, 90 million Ethiopians,
mm,
that would be a cause for war. A knock-on effect of that, by the way, is Egypt's machinations in Somaliland and Somalia, but we haven't got time for that. Second one is India-Pakistan. Kashmir split in two, but the important bit is that the waters that flow down from the Himalayas flow through the parts of Kashmir which India control before they then go into Pakistan, which puts India's hand on the tap. And again, they've got a treaty. They've always shared the water, but you do worry that in times of drought, does that change? That would also be a cause for war. So, yeah, it's a subject that is coming into focus. And those are just two of examples. There are others.
where there's a tap, it can be turned off, of course. Okay,
I mean, it
sorry.
would take 2 or 3 years to engineer it for the dams to be built to turn the tap off. In the Indian example I'm talking about, but that would also give you 2 or 3 years to start preparing for what you're going to do.
Yeah, exactly. A question from John, the festival chairman. A fascinating integration of all conflicts into the technical industrial world we inhabit, but aren't there less technical components too? Where do we get our food? What some sage promised us 2 millennia ago, where we still understand the language,
Yeah.
where we hold our ancestors, e.g., First Nations. What role do these more spiritual elements still play in the definition of
That's
homeland?
that. No, very good point. I mean, I hadn't really thought about the last one about the spiritual element, but the previous one, the food, yes, because what has happened in the last few years is that governments are beginning to look at trade through the security lens and guaranteeing the supply chain, including of food. And when you start looking at that sort of trade through the security lens, then again you start thinking, I could start taking action in order to do this. Spiritual side is really interesting, isn't it? You mess with your ancestors, people at your peril. It inflames passions when graveyards are bombed. Or I mean, I saw that in Kosovo when some of the graveyards in Pristina were bombed. Absolutely enraged. The Serbian graveyards absolutely enraged the Serbs. Um, yeah, again, I think don't. I think instinctively we know that, and ordinary people, I think, often know things a lot more than the experts instinctively because they're not encumbered by intellectual baggage. But yeah, I tell you what, there's a book in that. I'm not going to write it, but it's a really good point, well made.
Yeah, no, I was thinking, talking to you, it's politicians don't necessarily take into account that the
Yeah,
human
they
aspects
don't
of it.
factor in emotion enough.
No,
I mean, they like to almost think they're above emotion, but you've got to understand emotion and
yeah,
seems irrational.
yeah,
It goes deep. I mean, Putin plays on this. You know, I hope none of us really think that we are a threat to Russia and are about to invade them, but he is smart enough to know he can tap into the Russian psyche that remembers the Great Patriotic War, which we call World War II, and what Mother Russia went through, remembers 1914, remembers 1812, remembers all the times before that, and he can just tap into that emotion immediately and persuade them What I'm doing now is a preventive war, and some people will believe him. And there may be people watching this who think it's a preventive war. I think it's a colonialist war of conquest.
Mm.
But I understand why the Russians might disagree.
Yeah, yeah,
I just, sorry, Dave. Coming back to I mean, the question of spirituality and myth and so forth. Of course, a lot of the founding myths have geographic elements
Yeah.
built in them. I mean, a huge amount of them.
Kievan Rus was near the Dnieper River, yeah,
So
the
yes,
heartland of it.
and
The Serbs,
all these sorts of.
the heart of their culture is Kosovo. I mean, I'm not making an argument that therefore you can do X, Y, and Z now, 2,000 years later. Israel, 4,000 years old. Again, I'm not making the justification. We're just agreeing that how deep this stuff goes. And, it might be 2026, but we are still aware of 1406 or something.
Yeah, and juxtaposed to that, you have this sort of technocratic notion of borders. And this time last year, I visited Gorizia in on the border of Slovenia and Italy, and there was European.
Wasn't it lovely how the Czech Republic and Slovakia divorced peacefully, the Velvet Divorce? And also, about 4 years ago, I think it's Norway and Denmark agreed to swap a mountain. In fact, one of them gave the other a mountain out of the goodness of their hearts. There's a
Yeah.
lesson we can all learn.
Well, back to Gorizia, they had an exhibition because in the divisions with Yugoslavia and Italy, the border line was drawn through a graveyard.
Oh, I
You had
didn't know that.
people's bodies on one side or the other, and for a decade or so, you couldn't visit your relatives in the other side of the graveyard. If so, I mean, that, as I say, different notions of what borders are, um, causing all sorts of yeah, unnecessary human distress and so forth. Dave, how are we doing for time? Shall we?
It's bang on 8 o'clock. We have one more question. I'm happy for us to run on for a few minutes if Tim and
Yeah,
yourself.
try and do a quick answer, which is
Okay. This is from Emma Barker. What
hello,
about the
Emma.
symbolic importance of regions beyond a nation's borders, e.g., Ukraine and Russia, Kosovo and Serbia, Karelia and Finland, and Transylvania and Hungary?
What is the what of those?
The symbolic importance of regions beyond a nation's borders.
If you think they're part of yours, they're very symbolic. Yes, I mean, let's make East Prussia German again. What is it at the moment? Kaliningrad. Yeah, it, I mean, the Serbs will never accept. I mean, 192 countries at the UN could accept that Kosovo is an independent sovereign state as opposed to the 50 or 60 that say it is now. And the one that didn't would still be Serbia, and it never will. It would, it would be centuries before it did, because it just seems to go deep and it's tribal. And I think that actually is a sad central theme running through this entire conversation. We are tribal. We are also animals. We have this innate thing inside us that makes us nervous about the other. We've been working on it a very long time, partially through religion, which, I mean, I know it gets people killed, but it's also trying to bring us together as well. We are working on it. And I think that we did a reasonable job in the last 60, 70 years when we built these institutions to try to stop it. Despite all that we've been talking about, I am actually not a pessimist. I just think that sadly, we have these issues with each other. We always have done. And therefore, I'm sanguine about it because I don't think it's necessarily any worse now than it ever has been. And most of the time, it's okay. And so everything comes along, you think, oh my God, no. But we work our way through it eventually, and you get back on the straight and narrow, and then another one comes along. But, I would urge people not to be too depressed. It looks rocky at the moment, but it'll be smooth eventually.
Thank you. Somebody has just said, you must be an optimist, Tim. You've got a Leeds United badge behind you.
You're not wrong. I've only missed one game this season. And yes, I'm an yes, I'm going to finish 16th, I think.
Great.
Brilliant. Okay.
We've also got a request that you write the book about water.
Yes, please write the one on the importance of water.
You know, I spent 3 months researching a book about gold and then binned it. And then I spent another 3 months researching a book about AI and thought I'm not clever enough to just canvas and binned it. Water. I've got a couple of ideas for books. But I don't know if I will. There's lots of football matches to go to instead.
Sounds like a plan.
Well, thanks so much, Tim. That was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
And
well, thank you for the questions and thanks for the invite from what is an august organisation. Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. And it's kicked off our series really well. Dave, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for your company this evening. We hope that you found this as fascinating and as richly informative as we did. And a special thank you, of course, to Tim and to Philip. To keep up to speed with everything that we do, including writing competitions and courses, literary walks and more, please visit the website and sign up for our newsletter. Or you can follow us on Facebook, X, Blue Sky, Threads, or Instagram as @MKLitFest. Thank you, everybody, and until we meet again, take good care, read well, and please read widely. Thank you all, and good night.
Right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Philip. Thank you again for the invitation.
Yeah,
See you, Dave.
That was great.
Thank you
Pleasure,
very
Tim.
much. Absolutely fascinating.